Ezan had merely been passing nearby, a few light weeks away, when he had noticed the anomaly and static plaguing a long-range observational array. The static had been at first bothersome, but then curiously he noticed it was repeating, and having nothing better to do, while his ship harvested and refined the fuel needed from the atmosphere of a gas giant for the next leg of his cargo contract, he began tinkering with the observational array. To his surprise, an isolation of the feed static into a separate display resulted in a startling image. Humanoids, clearly in distress, and on some sort of craft that appeared to have smoke and sparks spraying from spring intermittently from the corridors behind the figures. There was an audio signal as well, but one that Ezan did not understand. But the look of distress was all too familiar. After doing some calculations, he saw that he had enough fuel refined so far to jump to the signal's location of origin and then back to refine more fuel. It was a delay for his contract, but he felt that it was worth it to save lives from cruel and unfeeling deaths in the void of space. Engaging his skip drive, the alien's craft rocketed across the distance in less than a day, and upon emerging from the skip jump, he could see the ship, perhaps half the size of his own, floating nearly derelict. There were still signs of life aboard. Lights dotted all across that ship, but as he got closer, he was shocked to see that the lights were each no larger than a scale upon his hand. When he saw movement in front of them, he realized they were not simply surface lights, but in fact illuminated windows, the Tudun. That shock was confirmed upon docking to what appeared to be the largest entry port on the ship. Ezan saw it was actually what looked to be a cargo bay, filled with thousands of these tiny bipedal aliens, observing him with visible trepidation as he stooped and carefully entered, still hunched over to avoid hitting his head on the gantries and cranes above. But then there was a sound that rang out from the aliens. Ones that he would in time find called themselves humans. And while the sound at first caused him to worry that he had caused further alarm, he realized that it was accompanied humans eagerly running up to touch him and embrace him with their tiny, stubby arms. It was cheering. The transfer off of their ship had been surprisingly swift. There were some tens of thousands of humans, but altogether their mass was only perhaps twice that of Ezan's own. On top of that, they brought many of their own food and storage reserves, although even Ezan could tell that what they had would be insufficient for more than another month or so. The abysmal condition of the ship they were abandoning was primarily due to external damage. The hull pockmarked with debris that looked to be from a micrometeoroid storm. He had doubts that the ship would have lasted more than a few more days at most before something else critical and irreplaceable broke. The humans had spread across his ship much in the manner of a yopfly infestation. In fact, he caught sight of some of the humans battling the few mature yopflies that had managed to avoid his own purge and cleaning routines. The humans battled the insectoid vermin with skill, and despite them being almost a half-dozen times the size of a human, he quickly found he could find no trace of the yopflies anywhere on his ship as the days passed, and he continued to refine fuel from the gas giant. A complete lack of any trace of yopflies was a blessing indeed among spacefarers in his experience, and while he never would have demanded service in exchange for sheltering the refugee humans, Ezan was still quite glad that the rescue had already begun to pay unexpected dividends. Then, to his surprise, a few days later, a human climbed his exterior garb and made their way up onto his horned snout. The human was baring their teeth, an expression that he'd seen the humans only make when the rest of their body language suggested excitement or happiness. The human began to make a wobbling groan, and at first Ezan was going to simply write it off as another odd quirk of the aliens he had rescued. But then he realized part of the warbling sounded familiar. Listening to it again as the human repeated the sound, he realized that if he closed his eyes and imagined it came from a child with a significant throat mutation, the human was attempting to say, "Thank you for saving us," in Isan's own language. Another week had passed, and while still not anywhere close to what he would consider clear, the humans had managed to make leaps and bounds in speaking with him. One of the leaders of the group of humans flagged his attention and said, "Friend Isan, savior of humanity, you've done much for us, but we would ask you for another boon." Isan nodded and saw that several dozen other humans had also approached, clearly anxious from the way they fidgeted. "We brought what supplies we could from our old generation ship, the Star of Orion, but those have begun to run dry. Would we be able to use some of your own food ration supplies while we continue to grow our own?" The human gestured towards a spare crew compartment, where the humans had begun to grow a short, seed-rich grass they called corn. "We anticipate we would only need enough for a month before our crop is ready to sustain us." Isan grinned back, an unnatural gesture that the humans seemed delighted by him mirroring, and stood, starting to move carefully over to one of the supply cabinets, cautiously watching where he stepped to avoid accidentally hurting any humans underfoot. They'd learned to give him a wide berth, but it was still a concern he had that someone would be in the wrong place at the wrong time and be crushed. Opening the supply cabinet, he pulled forth one of the emergency ration blocks, then a second, and a third. The set only had enough for him to survive a few weeks or so, and tasted abysmal to his palate. But when he had passed the food blocks to the humans, they were ecstatic, shouting and cheering like they had when he had first come aboard. The human who had made the request was jubilant. "1,000 thanks, Isan. This is enough to feed us all for months, and maybe even a year if we ration it sufficiently." As the humans began excitedly talking amongst themselves, Isan could see more of them coming out of the various hidey holes and crevices across the ship, celebrating in the bounty, with several of them making gestures of respect and thanks towards his comparatively enormous form. He also noticed more than a few of the humans no longer wore the fabric jumpsuits he had seen when they first had come aboard the ship. Many now sported outfits and clothing made of metal or flaps of overlapping plastic. It wasn't until he recognized a logo for a protein chip company that had been artfully incorporated into a minuscule skirted dress that he realized the humans must have been picking through his refuse, as it was one of his favorite flavors of dehydrated protein slurry chips, flavored to resemble a deep-sea delicacy on his home planet. Turning back to the human speaker, Isan made up his mind about the humans. He stepped over to the trash bunker set into one of the walls, Sucker. Most of the bunkers were fed by an internal conveyor belt system to the incinerator, where the hydrocarbon-based plastics and organics were burned, mostly to conserve space, as the fusion core of the ship required no additional energy beyond the refined gas insertions every few dozen light-years. As for the metals and anything else incapable of burning, they were simply formed into ballast slugs, an almost worthless supplement to his cargo that was only barely worth keeping aboard, and which many of his peers often preferred simply to jettison into space towards the nearest sun to be rid of them. Keying in a series of commands on the control panel, each button fully the height of one of these tiny humans, he input the kill command for the conveyor system, effectively halting the feed to the incinerator. Then Isan pulled open the bunker hatch and gestured broadly towards the humans, and then towards the waste bunker. He, too, had been doing his best to learn the humans' language, Although it was a strange one with many peculiarities of pronunciation and repetition, still, he had managed to cobble enough together to say, "You are welcome to whatever you need from anything I don't. And if your needs ever exceed this waste, speak with me, and I will see what other supplies I can spare." He was no longer well off, this transport job being menial compared to the stations and respect he had once held, but it was sufficient to cover his needs, and now it appeared sufficient to cover the needs of the humans as well. At his declaration, another resounding cheer broke out, many of the humans rushing forward to pull at things he had considered discardable garbage. His species was often condoned by space-going peer species for being somewhat heavy-handed in their packaging of consumable materials. Layers of foil, shrink netting, plastic casings, and fabric wraps were commonplace, designed to make the contents both visually appealing and resistant to perishing even beyond what most spaces would consider necessary for their needs. But now the humans were pulling out packaging, wrestling with sheets of thickened foil, and taking small knives made from what appeared to be shards and offcuts of metal to begin sawing at and cutting the fabric swatches into necessary shapes and forms. The turning of the planets came and went, and Izan became slightly older, but in his mind not much wiser. Generations of the humans had come and gone, and he was surprised to still see glimpses of refuse that appeared to have been passed through parent to child and through families as some manner of heirlooms. The things they were keeping were still flimsy trash in his mind. Foil that would rip if he tried to use it a second time, fabric that would fall apart after a single wash, and plastic that cracked and yellowed far too soon for Isan to want to put anything important within it. But for the humans, these materials could remain robust for an entire lifespan. Fabrics used to clothe multiple generations, and packages and containers that were only just now beginning to yellow, and still seeing regular use by the excited humans. He had spoken with them, and learned more of their fate, and why they had been adrift. Their planet had finally been rendered unsuitable for life, thanks to a series of solar storms that stripped what little habitable regions were remaining. After dozens of eras of resource exhaustion and pollution. It sounded uncomfortably like what had nearly happened to Isan's people before they had ventured forth towards the stars and expanded outwards, rather than remain on only their homeworld and bleed it dry. They said that their generation ship had been one of the last to leave, but the micrometeoroid storm had led them to believe that they were doomed to die without ever establishing a new homeworld. While none blamed him, Isan still felt a surge of guilt when they spoke of the lives that had been lost as they waited for some aid, any aid, to come to their distress call. They reassured Isan that they knew he had traveled as fast as his ship was capable of, but he was still frustrated by how slow the trip to the rescue point had been. Not for the first time, he mused, if his old ship could have made the trip faster, but when he saw the confused looks of the humans nearby, he realized he'd said it out loud. "What ship do you refer to?" they asked. In response, Isan stood carefully and gestured for them to follow him as he made his way down to the cargo bay. The bay was mostly filled with hyperdrive parts for their current shipment, superconducting coils and emitter amplifiers for the most part. But tucked into a back corner of the bay was a separate section, the bulkheads locked at all times. The humans had rarely been down to the cargo bay, respecting Isan's cargo and not wanting to disturb it in a way that could impact an eventual delivery. As a result, few had been down here before, and fewer still had even known about this separate section. As the titanic alien unlocked and opened it, the humans could see that within was a ship of beautiful and elegant design. Swooping curves marked a sharp difference from the blocky and angular structure of the cargo trawler they were riding. Mao. This craft was also much smaller, looking to hold only 2 or 3 passengers, and likely no additional space for cargo. It had been damaged at some point, carbon scarring and missing plate sections across much of the front and left wing. As the human looked over the vessel with Izan's reluctant blessing, they saw the center was a space for a hyperdrive engine core, one large enough to rival that of their cargo vessel while being magnitudes smaller in size. "What manner of ship was this, friend Izan?" The large alien ran his hand across the pointed bow of the ship. It was a royal interceptor of Lies, once upon time, but that was a lifetime ago. He looked across sadly to the far wall. Hanging there were a set of mementos, a chipped helmet with a brilliant glass-like frill still vibrantly intact, an extendable staff with a gently curved blade at the end, one that came to a razor-sharp, monomolecular edge, notwithstanding the occasional chip on the edge of the weapon. And finally, next all those, was a banner of the House of Lies, depicting an 8-legged scarab antelope dancing upon a green and black striped field. A lifetime ago, those had been his helm and weapon, and the banner of the last royal house he'd had a chance to serve under. As he stepped back toward the door, Izan worried if he should close and relock this section of the ship, a part of him wondering if the humans might threaten to break down his battle-worn treasures as more raw material and goods for their own needs. But then the thought was gone, replaced by a certainty that he had seen the humans act honorably and with care and consideration for his requests of their presence. He would never have said this himself to the humans, but he got the impression they felt that they were imposing upon him. Meanwhile, Izan simply saw their presence as helpfully symbiotic at best, but only harmlessly parasitic at worst. A sort of elaborate and complex recycling venture that doubled as pest control. Many more binary cycles passed, and Izan could see his scales had begun to bleach and whiten along the edges, a common sign of middle age for his species. The humans had continued to survive and thrive, every so often asking him to make a quick stop at an unoccupied world, so the humans could send some members to establish a colony there, but always with Izan's transport as the home ship. He had set aside an additional space within the cargo bay for the humans, where a small metropolis had now sprung up, built from the reclaimed scrap plugs of refuse metal and non-incineratable solids he had accumulated for some time, now hollowed out to form homes and other structures. Izan mostly kept to himself these days, but he saw the occasional outside presence in the form of merchants and others he coordinated with for his cargo shipments. Apart from a bit of an argument over some missing hyperdrive components ages ago, he was well regarded as a peculiar but effective courier by those in need of a cargo hauler. Then the news had broken. At first, a few whispered rumors here and there, eventually trickling to make their way to Izan's ship. But he refused to pay them heed, worried about getting his hopes up about false rumor. But the hope it promised was inescapable, and began to wonder if they were true, for there were whispers that the royal bloodline of the House of Lies had survived, the youngest scion having escaped to the wild regions and hiding in exile until she came of age. It was all conjecture, of course. A few visible similarities between the Lost Queen and an outspoken rebel who was drawing the ire of the new empire. It was unconfirmed to any sort of significant degree, but it was the most solid thing he had heard in all his time since the royal house had first fallen. Then the rumors became substantiated reports from the new leaders that postured themselves as rightful rulers of the empire, but held control only through the power of their coup so long ago. These usurpers had begun paying bounties for knowledge and information about the whereabouts of the lost queen, and soon requests became demands. Isan heard of many whom he considered friends and suspected to privately be loyalists in their heart of hearts, being beaten, arrested, and interrogated for any news. Isan believed his isolation to be the reason he had been overlooked, but more than once the humans had helped him repaint the livery on his ship and recode the transponder IDs to evade detection by a patrol cruiser or destroyer. The humans having crafted ingenious airtight suits from discarded drink canisters and spare loops of water tubing. They held up surprisingly well to the hard vacuum as they helped with the external changes needed to avoid notice from the investigating authorities. He had begun to follow the news more closely, even going so far as to retrofit the broadcast receiver with the humans' help to listen in on intergalactic news updates and unencrypted military transmissions about the Queen's movements and actions. But then the moment he had been dreading came through. The Queen had been captured aboard the flagship of the usurpers' fleets, but subsequently escaped aboard an unarmed shuttle. The Queen had fled to hide amongst the dense rings of an unoccupied and uncolonized system, but the fighter wing following her were in hot pursuit, and the military reports seemed more and more certain that she would be captured within days, if not hours. For the first time since he had met the humans, Isan wept bitterly, cursing sluggishness of his freighter, and knowing that even if he were to expend all his fuel and push his hyperdrive to exhaustion, it would take a week and a half to reach the rebellious royal, by which point she would be long captured or dead. He realized he had not expressed himself in front of the humans like this before, but he didn't much care now what they thought of his weeping. The humans, for their part, had gathered, but while many appeared to share his apprehension, Isan saw that most of them hadn't said anything to him, instead forming a huddle amongst themselves, discussing in low, quiet voices that he couldn't have made out if he had tried. Then the leader stepped forward and addressed him. "Friend Isan, you have done much for us, and while we had intended for this to be a surprise to mark our 300th year aboard your vessel, we feel like now would be the better time to present your gift." "Gift?" Isan wiped with the back of a claw at the tears in his eyes. "I appreciate your consideration, little ones," he said, struggling to smile despite the sorrow he felt. "But I do not know how a gift of yours would aid me at this juncture." "Just follow us, please," they said, and he saw many conspiratorial winks and smiles amongst the humans about whatever secret they had for him. He'd been giving gifts from humans before, of course, and unfortunately nothing he had received previously would have been even remotely helpful in rescuing the Queen, and regaining the honor he felt was slipping between his fingers. The humans led him down to the cargo bay, but not to their city as they had done many times before. Instead, they marched to the separate section of the hangar bay where his mementos had been stored. He realized he had not set foot in here in some time, the rumors and news of the Queen almost seeming like to set foot next to such mementos would have forced him to decide if they were or not, and if he should abandon and forget those hopes forevermore. He saw the large sheet was still across the vessel, but he also noticed at the end of it were dozens of mechanical winches the humans had set up, attached to the ends of the tarp. On a shouted command, the winches were engaged, and within seconds the tarp was pulled off of the Royal Interceptor he had salvaged so long ago, and attempted time and again to repair with limited success. But here it was in full glory, and with even a coat of paint that almost exactly matched the original color scheme visible beneath the scratch and scuffs that had since been buffed out. On the parts of the hull that had been blasted away, he could see it had been repaired, hundreds of tiny plates overlapping to form an unbroken hull. Each one was fully the size of a trio of humans with their arms spread, But to Isan, each of these scales could have fit in the palm of his hand, with room to spare. A power relay was engaged somewhere within the ship, and it hummed to life, a sound that Isan had not heard since he had been a young recruit. It brought tears to his eyes again, this time from joy, but even as his heart leapt to his throat, he steeled himself for disappointment. I cannot say how much it means to me, but the heart of such a ship's power was in its speed, and the hyperdrive was gutted and sold long before I ever came across it in the junkyard those eons ago. The leader of the humans stepped forward, tossing her curls of dark hair over her shoulder, and she smiled. Friend Isan, we were well aware. In fact, it was one of the first focuses of our repairs upon this ship. He was scarcely believing what he was seeing, as stepping towards the rear of the ship, he could see through the cowling vents, the telltale green glow of the hyperdrive coils and impellers. Furthermore, the hum of the core had been now replaced by the warbling whine of the coils as they began charging, and Isan could tell by the pitch alone that the ship was now as fast as it had ever been. Perhaps even more so, as he noticed an additional pair of coils the humans had managed to cleverly stack in front by replacing one of the passenger seats. We've left everything as close as we could figure to the original settings and conditions, said the human spokeswoman. And while we did have to pull out the one seat to make room for the new coils, there's still room for a passenger, as well as the pilot. She's fueled and the cannons are charged and ready. Isan was now fully in shock, but after a moment that was replaced by steely instinct, his mouth closing into a set line of firm resolve. Grabbing his staff from the wall, he slotted it into its waiting receptacle alongside the pilot seat, and carefully took the helm as well, holding it reverently for a moment, before placing it back upon his skull. He was pleased to note that the humans had not only preserved, but also replicated the livery that had been across the ship. The eight-legged scarab antelope of House Lies air upon a field of green and black. Stepping into his interceptor, Isan could feel the familiar instincts kicking in, even after so much time had passed, and he wrapped his claws around the control sticks. As the canopy began to slide forward to close, he turned to the humans, saying in a broken voice, "How can I ever repay you?" The speaker of the humans smiled broadly and said, "You've done more for us than we could have ever asked. This is our thanks to you, and you can honor it and us by saving your queen. Now go, and know we are all here waiting for you to return home together." With that, there was a wild cheer that went up from the humans. As the canopy sealed shut, Isan could feel a mixture of pride, gratefulness, and other emotions he couldn't name welling up and fluttering in his chest. As he saluted the humans fiercely and then engaged the throttle, he was jolted back into his seat by the acceleration, leaping out of the cargo bay and into the darkness of space. Quickly engaging the navigational computer and spooling up the hyperdrive, he could feel exhilaration pulsing in his veins as he activated the drive, blinking forward at a pace that his cargo transport could never dream of. He could feel his eyes welling up again with appreciation and joy as the lines of stars streaked past, before he shook his head and steadied himself. As he came out of the hyperspeed skip jump, he could already see the shuttle, juking between the asteroids and ice shards floating through space, pursued by a fighter wing that were darting and trying to shoot down the Royal. With a bellowing howl, he engaged the engines, warming up the cannons to full capacity as he opened a wide transmission channel. "Attention all usurpers and dogs of traitors. This is Sir Isan of House Lies, and I am here to defend my queen."